is Trump's movement a cult? It's clearly a strong culture. It's clearly a strong culture that uses outgroups as a foil to build a strong group identity. It's harder to build a strong group identity when you're trying to do big tent populism of the type, that Kamala Harris was attempting. Human tribal instincts are. They are adaptations in our species for building solidarity in communities. They are not adaptations for hostility. Leadership is not just about the future. It requires a close relationship with the past and a willingness to engage in sentiment and nostalgia about the past, because those are some of the strongest human drives.
It appears that strong cultures aren't very open to things that don't align. What would your feedback be? Michael, welcome to the UltraGrowth podcast. How are you going?
Well, it's a very eventful day. We just had an election in this country, if you've heard. I happen to have heard. But I'm doing well. It's a funny thing in New York. Whenever something traumatic happens in the world, it tends to coincide with our very best weather. So people walk around not knowing how to feel because the weather is just perfect today and everyone wants to just be joyous. But something happened that, complicates that. 9/11 was the same. I mean, it was like the most beautiful day, but something horrible was happening.
And it's interesting, right? Like your expertise and your work is so important, but it's so relevant to what's going on right now in terms of, tribalism, community, groupthink, and how collectively we move together or sometimes not so well together, right?
Yes, I think that I had originally dreamed that my book would come out during the prior election, but the book took me much longer to finish. Or I'm kind of a perfectionist, and so then I waited for this election because I thought it was the time when the topic would resonate on so many levels. I mean, I'm a business school professor, and I primarily wrote the book to share a playbook, for managers and leaders about how to understand human group psychology and the ways that it can be harnessed for collective action and unity, or even harnessed for change, which people don't always immediately think. But the best organizational change people are experts about group psychology and how to use it. But at this particular moment, it resonates a lot with regard to understanding the partisan loyalties and also the political strategies. So we have, a successful case of populist politics, which is an age-old formula that draws on tribal psychology. It draws on the sort of nostalgia, the sense that things were better in the past, and this urge to kind of reinstitute the past, that we feel. This is what I call the ancestor instinct in my book. And this notion that we use outgroups as a foil for constructing a strong in-group identity. And that is the key element of divisive populism. You basically say, okay, some new group of people, either across the border or living as immigrants among us, has come here, and the good old days are gone. And the solution, obviously, is to restore the old days and to, expel these newcomers and, go back to better, simpler time. That's, we heard that in the mid 20th century in Europe. We've heard it. You've had it in Australia from time to time, and, it's alive and well. It's not the only political strategy that draws on tribal psychology, but it's a familiar one, and it worked.
So in terms of, your research and your book Tribal, which is going to be coming out shortly, like, was your motive, when this idea was born, was it born from what was happening politically or more for corporates and in the business context, or a bit of both?
It's a great question, and the answer is, as you suspect, a bit of both. So I started writing the book, 8 years ago, let's say, and that was after already 20 years of teaching at the world's top business schools. I've taught at Columbia Business School for almost 20 years. I taught before at Stanford Business School for almost 10 years, starting at a very young age. And I'm a cultural psychologist. I'm a behavioral scientist in the field that sort of spans psychology and anthropology. And so I have been developing a toolkit, a sort of playbook for managers about how to use what we know about the human psychology of culture, why we are culture creating animals and how we are moved by cultural loyalties. A playbook for how to use that when running a team, when unifying a divided organization, when trying to galvanize organizational change, or for community leaders or activist investors or anyone else who wants to kind of foment solidarity around a cause, right? This is very relevant. So I've been developing ways to teach this and developing frameworks to explain it for decades. And I started writing a book, signed a book contract that was called something like Tribe Mind, and it was about how to use that. But then over the last 5 years in this country, something has changed, which is that we've had a series of really deep group conflicts, and it's the sort of rift between the red and the blue parties. It's the record racial protests in the streets and counter protests, and it's religious strife, whether it's people shooting up a synagogue or a mosque, or abroad, these sort of sectarian civil wars, whether in Sudan or in Gaza, Israel. So this has created a new way of talking, which I kind of call the trope of toxic tribalism. And it's something that started with pundits like Tom Friedman and Andrew Sullivan, Amy Chua, who wrote fairly riveting essays and books that essentially argued that there are these deeply evolved groupish instincts that have somehow reawakened. And that's the part that is a little complicated in this argument, because they're arguing that these tendencies are age old, but at the same time new. So and the idea is that they've sort of reawakened, and now we don't see reality clearly, and we can't talk to the other side, and there's no way to get the genie back into the bottle again, and it becomes a little bit dark and fatalistic, despairing. And I think that makes for an interesting article, but it doesn't make for great policies. And it couldn't really be less accurate as a description of what human tribal instincts are. They are adaptations in our species for building solidarity in communities. They are not adaptations for hostility. They can contribute to conflicts as a kind of side effect of building in-group loyalties that can create conflicts that involve hostilities, but the conflicts don't start from hostility, and to assert that they do is really unhelpful. It's our instincts are not perfectly adaptive. Like, take our instinct for eating sweet foods, right? It helped our ancestors eat fruit and get the encouragement they need. But now, for a person who lives on a street with a donut shop, it leads to unhealthy behavior. And that's not because it's a gluttony instinct. It's an instinct for getting vitamin C, but that in this environment, goes awry, right? And so I think our tribal instincts are similar to that, but we really, if we want to understand how they work and how we can work with them, we should do it in a science-informed way rather than listening to these sort of colorful Manichaean tales that journalists can spin, about atavistic human instincts reawakening in the 21st century. It's all very compelling when you read it, but it's not. It shouldn't be taken that seriously. I mean, the idea of tribalism is right, but let's understand what the tribal instincts really are and what it means that those things have gotten tangled up in our politics.
Yeah, look, I think there's so much in that, and I love the intersection of psychology, sociology, anthropology. And, for me, looking through the lens of your work, uh, you know, one can start to understand our operating system. And I think a lot of us believe that a lot of these decisions that we tend to make are like moral issues. I tend to not see it that way. I look at a lot of this is hard coded in who we are in this tribal instinct, in that we use reason, we use principles, we use our ability to be rational as human beings to kind of move against some of the downsides of these tribal instincts, right? And so for me, it's not a moral issue. I think the diversity movement. I was having a conversation about this with someone yesterday. I think the diversity movement inherently is good. I think how it's laid upon people is important, though, right? Because not, I personally believe, I don't believe that we're necessarily wired to understand how to accept a large group of people that may not look, feel, or move like we do, right? So it's like, how do we encourage a diversity movement in a way which aligns with maybe some of our tribal instincts to separate sometimes? And I think, I guess what I'm trying to say, for me, it's not a moral issue, and I'm interested in your thoughts about that. And I guess, one of the questions I have is, in terms of tribal instincts, how do you think they could be harnessed positively then within communities and in organizations?
Well, in my view, that I take a view, as it sounds like you do, from anthropology and psychology, that humans evolved away from other primates through a couple of very specific uh, changes to our group psychology. And in the book, I call them the peer instinct, which is this impulse to kind of mesh with the people that we're around so that we can work as a united force and collaborate in a way that other primates can't. And then there's the hero instinct, which is this urge to contribute to the community and in exchange receive status and standing and tribute from the group. And then the final one, which I think is the least appreciated, is the ancestor instinct. And that's this kind of ache for continuity and tradition that we feel, and why we listen to the elders' stories, and why when we find an antique, we almost fetishize it, like, wow, somebody made this 4 generations ago, and we should preserve this and learn from it. And I think that, from the archaeological evidence, we can see that this last instinct came around in the last 100,000 years. And when these three instincts were present together, you suddenly had this tribal living where the culture that was shared by a community started to accumulate across the generations. The ancestor instinct meant that you had tribal memory. The hero instinct meant that there was a motivation to kind of build on the wisdom of the past. And the peer instinct was like a mechanism so that new ideas got shared, and so that people would all come with get on the same page. And once, we were living in these communities that had sort of community level learning, we were more, I guess you'd say, fit. We were more able to survive and thrive each century without individuals becoming any more brainy, right? And so that's the sort of killer app of humanity more than anything else. It's not our rationality. It's this capacity for collective learning and being able to tap into the knowledge. You and I, 99% of what we know is not something we figured out personally, like personally through experimenting on the world. It's what we got taught in school. It's what our parents taught us. It's what we learned by observation. It's inherited knowledge, right? Inherited from the community. So that's why humans are smart, not because of any, giant brain or candle power. So then when it comes to an organizational culture, there's also, cumulative cultural evolution. A corporate culture is not a fixed thing. It changes over the decades, and it changes in some ways organically, but in some ways deliberately by leaders who are smart enough to realize that the culture has to fit the strategy and that the culture is somewhat moldable. And one of the major ways that we mold the culture is by drawing on the ancestor instinct. We look to parts of our past as a collectivity, and we cite them as precedents to legitimize the new direction that we want to go. So some people may say that Trump is a radical departure from what the country should be. But then, if Trump wants to legitimize, he can say, well, what I'm saying is not that different from what Abraham Lincoln said, and it's not that different from what this president said, and so the past of any group is vast and variegated, and there's an African proverb, the past speaks in many voices, that Nelson Mandela used to cite. And part of what we do when we're trying to change an organization is we engage in selective memory of the past, and we find pieces of the past that are suitable as precedents for the direction we want to go now. And we call people's attention to them, and then people have a sense of continuity and a sense of tradition and a sense of legitimacy. So that's a basic way that tribal psychology can be used to bring people together and to sell people on a slightly new emphasis, of maybe it's an emphasis of, are we competing on cost or competing on quality, or are we a domestic organization or a global organization? We can mine our heritage to prop up the current direction.
I've noticed historically in business that strong cultures, and when I say strong cultures, I don't necessarily mean good, but strong cultures within firms and even politically, they tend to seem to have real strong boundaries of what they don't accept. They can almost look cult-like. In your experience, do strong cultures, do they need to have strong boundaries, and are they very clear around themselves versus the others? Because what I'm asking is, it appears that strong cultures aren't very open to things that don't align. What would your feedback be to that? And I would say that could be problematic, right, too.
I'm a business school professor, and there's a literature on whether strong corporate cultures, meaning high consensus, high consistency, high intensity, and there are ways of measuring that with surveys, or you can measure it with big data content analysis, by looking at all the emails in an organization or the Slack, communication in an organization. Strong cultures generally, are adaptive because they serve to motivate people. You have to be selective in who you hire, but you find people whose intrinsic motivations align with the strongly pronounced values of the firm. And for them, they'll work at that firm for less money than they would work elsewhere because it's allowing them to actualize themselves, and it doesn't matter what the values are, So at some Silicon Valley companies, it's sort of like a punk rock ethos, whereas at Procter and Gamble, it may be 1 degree removed from evangelical Christianity, but it's it's a different. It's a coming to work. It feels like home because that's but there are costs at the same time to having a strong culture as opposed to a more diffuse or variegated culture, and that is with regard to diversity. Can you incorporate the full range of talent? Can you go to other countries as easily? And with regard to adaptability, so if the environment shifts, are you able to pivot, or are you kind of locked in to what you're currently competent at, even after that's no longer, adaptive? And we can think of a lot of examples of companies who they had a strong culture, they had a strong us and them, perception of the world, and as a result, they tended to derogate or caricature their competition rather than learn from their competition. And it's particularly dangerous that at a moment of threat, when there's a moment of threat, that's when people are most likely to, valorize their own tradition and denigrate traditions of other tribes, other companies. But when you're under threat in a corporate world, that's exactly when you need to be most open to learning that there may be something that needs to be adjusted. So it's definitely a blessing and a curse, to build a really strong culture. Some people try to have it both ways, where they say, okay, we're going to be an ambidextrous company, and we have our strong culture at our main headquarters, but then we're going to have an R&D facility that's located elsewhere with a really different norms, flex time, high turnover, and have this kind of openness learning satellite, to the main company. Or some companies say, okay, we have a really strong culture, but change and taking risks is the core value of that culture. So Netflix might be an example there, where they're just really, it seems like a paradox there. They're like, we are a very strong culture company, but we are a strong culture, not like a family, but like a pro sports team, which means you might get cut tomorrow, because you're no longer world. And you have to be totally okay with that, and, even the person who authored that policy got cut like a few months later, so it's, so they're managing to pull off that paradox at Netflix, at least for now.
Are we, Michael, seeing that operating at a political level? Like, I mean, Trump's in many ways, he's an anomaly, right? Like I think he's built an extremely strong culture or walls around, his camp. And I mean, I would argue maybe even on the left and what we're seeing just politically in the US, things seem to be more tribal than ever. And do you think that this is a phenomena that has been kind of driven by Trump, or is this something that you think is the start of how it's going to be in the United States politically, I guess?
There are people who've made that. There are some pundits who've made that argument. The pundits differ on their particular story about why this reawakening of the big difference between my view, that I try to build a science-based view, and what you see in the newspapers, is that tribalism usually gets portrayed by the pundits as an instinct to hate outsiders, an instinct for hostility, an innate animosity, for them. And I disagree. I don't think, a species that was wired that way would not be as successful as our species has been. In fact, there was an early human species called Neanderthals who were prone to warring with all of the neighboring tribes, and prone to cannibalism, and then this other group, Homo sapiens, emigrated from Africa to Europe, and they traded with neighboring groups rather than warring with them, and they mated with neighboring groups rather than eating them. And that turned out to be a better foreign policy, right? It turned out to be a more adaptive foreign policy in the long run, which we can understand from game theory reasons, right? You're protected against risk and protected against local calamities, if you have a broader network and if you're sharing knowledge and, that sort of thing. It's like having a more diverse portfolio, in financial terms. So I think that, just like our donut habits do not reflect a gluttony instinct, our political habits do not reflect a hostility instinct. Okay, so that's an important thing to point out. And then another thing that is part of what you're asking here is Trump's movement a cult? It's clearly a strong culture. It's clearly a strong culture that uses outgroups as a foil to build a strong group identity. And I think that, it's harder to build a strong group identity when you're trying to do big tent populism of the type, that Kamala Harris was attempting, because, you will have less in common among the members of your contingency than when you're working with a narrower in group, but with a strong set of shared beliefs, as Trump has been doing. And part of the irony is that even though Trump, was following an age-old playbook of, the only real Americans are like this, the group of people who rallied around that, it turns out to be diverse. So if you look at Hispanic Americans, really, really large fractions, historically large fractions, voted for Trump. And I think the reason is that, the traditional identity politics that guides a lot of political practices is a set of stereotypes. And, individuals are complex. Each generation is different. And, and a category like Hispanic, it's a category that makes sense from outside. It doesn't make sense from inside. People who have just emigrated from Venezuela, they're not particularly insulted by comments about Puerto Rico because they don't think of themselves as being from the same part of the world. And, we've all known that Cubans, vote Republican. Cuban Americans vote Republican because they're coming from a left-wing autocracy. And, same for Venezuelans, same for, people from many parts of Central America where you have progressive regimes who've become repressive, and so many of the notes that Trump is hitting about freedom and about closing the borders surprisingly resonated with the Hispanic American population, with large swaths of it. Now, I don't think that we can then say that Trump's movement is a cult. I think that the fact that there's this kind of openness, that its boundaries are porous, it is more inclusive. I think that, it's sometimes claimed that a cult is just a strong culture, that a strong culture becomes a cult. But I do think if you look at research on cults, there's a couple of really defining characteristics that are worth understanding. So the trademark move of a cult, whether it's a quasi-religious cult or whether it's, say, an insurgency group that operates, like a cult, is that it creates a monopoly of prestige, and it does that through a technique that's called network closure or network isolation. So the standard recruiting playbook for a cult is you find an alienated person, like a transfer student on a large college campus, or a soldier recently returned from war, or someone who's alienated in between places, and then you love bomb them. But cult recruiters pose as ordinary people and are really warm and invite them to a dinner of friends, which turns out to be mostly fellow members of the cult, who hang on their every word and make them feel important and tell them they have spiritual potential. And then they get an invitation to come to a retreat Oh, come to our group, our church is having a retreat, our political group is having a retreat. And this is usually held in a bucolic location where cell phones don't work and where there's no access to contact with anyone but the charismatic cult lecturers. And it's a long schedule each day of sort of confession sessions, charismatic lectures, group discussions, and low protein diet, so that people, a little bit of sleep deprivation. And then a pretty high percentage of people who've gone through that stage are then interested in the next step, which is moving into a collective residence of the organization, where you are gradually pressured to kind of give your life resources to the organization, to cut off ties with old friends, and then ultimately with family as well. And you're usually told, well, your family are very nice people, but they're infected by the mainstream culture, which is hostile to the good work of the church or the good work of the insurgency group. And then when you cut off ties with them, they are typically angry. And so they call or they try to come get you. And that sort of corroborates the narrative of the cult, of the outsiders as being hostile. And so what you then achieve is that people are living completely enveloped by other cult members. And normally we live in a world where our prestige is not monolithic, where I may admire the Pope, I may admire Elon Musk, and I may also admire, some NFL quarterback, right? So no one of those people can completely manipulate me because I have these countervailing, alliances in terms of who I admire. But cult members are removed from all that. So the only people that they admire are the cult leaders. The only people that have status in their environment are the cult leaders. And when that happens, approval from the cult leaders becomes like a drug that people will do, increasingly extreme things to maintain. And you get this sort of moral absolutism where people are like, well, I know that people may be hurt by this bomb, but the bomb is important for achieving world liberation or whatever. And so you get this Machiavellian moral absolutism that comes with cults. So I think that I don't see a cult in the Trump administration, but there are things that verge on it. There are things that verge on it. But hopefully it's a more open system.
Michael, you touched on something there, around the ethnic community, Latin Americans and Cuban Americans, and the complexity around the human psychology, right? We had layered values, and some values, I think, trump other values, right? No pun intended. But would you say that the left have kind of missed the mark on what they think their traditional voter base, being comprised of a lot of ethnic Americans, want and value?
I think, we're seeing that. I mean, we're still combing through the results, but the accusation from ethnic minority communities to the Democrats is always, don't take our votes for granted. Like if you're not doing enough for us, we will look elsewhere, right? And I think that has happened. It started to happen with George W. Bush. This kind of compassionate conservatism and understanding that the Hispanic Americans who are citizens don't necessarily see their interests as aligned with people who are coming to the country illegally. But I think we're seeing that, and I think that it may be that there's been a sort of stereotyping of who these people are and what they value that doesn't capture their full complexity as individuals, because immigrants tend to come to the country for economic opportunities, and they don't want to be patronized too, and they don't think that they need special help. They come with a mercantile philosophy, and they're eager for opportunity. So they, like for example, I'm in Harlem. Our business school campus is in Harlem, and in Harlem, you have the African American community and you have the American African community, and they're quite different. Little Senegal is quite different from Strivers Row in terms of the kind of conversations that you'll have with people. And I've had a lot of conversations with African cab drivers over the last year about how they support Trump and the reasons why they support Trump. And those, I think, are different than the arguments that that I hear from my African American friends. So first of all, people who are immigrants, that shapes their worldview. People who come from a country where there has been a left-wing dictator, well, that shapes what notes attract them and what notes don't attract them. And then people don't like being lumped together, and so I think that we have to do a reassessment of traditional identity politics, as it's practiced, because we've seen something new in the last day.
Absolutely. Just moving to corporates again, in terms of business and in teams, how could leaders leverage an understanding of tribal instincts to create a stronger team? Like, what are some of the things that they can do?
One of the key themes in my book, Tribal, is this notion that we tend to misunderstand cultures, whether it's the culture of a team or culture of an organization, the culture of a country. And I don't know exactly why. Maybe the field of anthropology is partly to blame, but there's this notion that cultures are permanent fixtures, that cultures change slowly, if at all, at a glacial pace, and with great pain, And I just think that's absolute nonsense. I mean, you and I are old enough to have seen, 5 years ago, people didn't use they as a pronoun for an individual. Now you're considered to be obstinate if you refuse to do it. Same-sex marriage was an outrage, 20 years ago, and now it is taken for granted. So cultures change, even with regard to the most sacred institutions. And one of the reasons I think that we often think that cultures don't change is the ancestor instinct, that we have a need for continuity that causes us to hold the illusion that our forefathers were just like us, and I think that, what our forefathers meant by the pursuit of happiness was completely different from what we even mean by the word happiness now. They weren't talking about hedonism or self-expression. They were talking about happiness meant something very different to them. But we like to think that we have the same beliefs and the same ways of living as our ancestors, because it makes us feel connected, right? But in any case, the book is a book about change. And I divide that into two basic categories, which is that the cultures affecting an individual or a group, they fluctuate a lot in the short term from situation to situation, because all of us have internalized many cultures. There's the culture of where we grew up, maybe the culture of where we went to school, maybe our family is culturally mixed, maybe we come from a religion with a specific culture, then we went into a profession, or we went into an organization where we internalized a lot, or we're an intense rock climber, or we're an intense kite surfer, or something where we have a set of values and beliefs around the avocation that shapes our life. So we have many tribes inside us, as Walt Whitman said, I am large, I contain multitudes, right? And they can't all drive at once because there are conflicts in the instructions. So they take turns at the wheel. And the psychology of that, I call it triggering. In the academic literature, we call it, situational cues. But the way that we know about this, that we've talked about a lot in the last year, is what we call code switching. And that is that when a person who grew up in multiple subcultures finds themselves in front of an audience that looks and talks a particular way that is one of their tribes, they tend to automatically shift into a different dialect, a different register that matches the audience that they're in front of. And when Obama was president, the comedians Key and Peele, I don't know if they're big in Australia, but they dined out on this for the whole 8 years, of different, funny little quirks of Obama's life, because he had the reflex of shifting into African-American vernacular when he was around an African-American group, and then shifting right back into a white Midwestern newscaster's, voice when he was in front of a white audience, sometimes to comical effect, And with Kamala Harris, she speaks differently when she's speaking to her sorority sisters in Atlanta or speaking to lawyers in the Bay Area, just different subcultures that she is authentically part of that come to the surface in response to a situation, a social situation. And so that is the peer instinct, this idea that we have a set of shared habits and assumptions, and our audience, as well as the sort of artifacts that hint at the audience. So it may be how people are dressed, it may be the food that's being served, or the style of the architecture. It just kind of brings one cultural lens to mind, or it brings another cultural lens to the fore. And so managers can do a lot with that. It's one of the reasons why we have the return to the office movement right now, that during the pandemic, a lot of organizations that conduct ongoing productivity measurement, what they saw was that during work from home, individual productivity went up. Individual employees were getting their to-do list done, but they weren't necessarily solving problems in a way that coordinated well with the needs of other divisions. They weren't, thinking through the lens of the organizational culture, because they were at home, in their home office with their family, and they weren't. And so when you're at the office, you're cued to think for me, to think like what's good for Columbia Business School. When I'm at home, I don't think that way as much. But it's not an unmixed blessing, because the same executives, when they want their employees to think outside of the box about a completely new product line, they will hold an off-site retreat, maybe at a beach resort, because they don't want people to think in terms of the conventional ways of the organizational culture. They want to get people away from reminders of the organizational culture, so that people are free to think in out of the box, completely different ways for that day or two, before we come back and we need to do the everyday work where coordination is more important. So understanding the triggers of the peer instinct are important. And then I talk about the hero instinct, which is this kind of urge to contribute, to be pro-social. And that is another thing that good leaders are aware of. And what are the triggers of the of the hero instinct? It tends to be symbols, icons of the group. Soldiers tend to follow flags into battle. At strong culture organizations, you have portraits of the founder. You have logos everywhere. People are carrying mugs, and they have screensavers, and they wear shirts that, have the company color, or have the company, symbols that, inflame people's motivations to be a real contributor and to get all of the recognition that comes with that. And then the final part, which is the ancestor instinct, this sort of nostalgia and this urge to do things in traditional ways. Well, a situational trigger that is very potent with regard to creating that traditionalism is ceremonies. And by ceremonies, I mean, public group events that often involve simultaneous speech or simultaneous singing, simultaneous movement, and also tend to involve references to the collective past. So it's the kind of thing that, companies often will do at an all-hands meeting, like, let's talk about when Hewlett and Packard first founded this company in their garage and what they were trying to accomplish. And then, let's all stand up and do the Hewlett Packard cheer, or the Hewlett Packard, I don't know what it would be, but these ceremonies are things that people were starved for, during the pandemic. And whether it's Taco Tuesday or Meditation Monday or whatever, they might be ceremonies at the level of a particular team or at the particular business unit, but they kind of are really strong reminders, even at like a neurological level, this part of, acting in unison with other people. It shuts off the self-focused, critical thinking part of our brain, and it creates unity experience that makes people, ready to sacrifice for the group at a higher level than they would be otherwise. It's why leaders, give these sentimental speeches before a battle about the heroic ancestors who fought on the same soil, and it makes people think, okay, well, I want to be a heroic, uphold the heroic tradition of military valor, of my people, that kind of thing. So good leadership is not just about the future. It requires a close relationship with the past and a willingness to engage in sentiment and nostalgia about the past, because those are some of the strongest human drives.
That's a very, very, very good answer, Michael. And look, we'll close there. I can't wait to read the book, and I know that the audience is really going to benefit from material as well.
Yeah, it's the U.S. version, but it's a lot of the CEOs and executives who've read the book have said, they wish they had read this book, 10 years before. So I think it captures things that people kind of know, but don't quite have a label for. And this will help you understand it and be able to explain it to other people in a way that goes a little bit beyond the insights from experience.
Where can people learn more about you and the book, Michael? I'll have it on the show notes as well.
Yeah, I have a book website. It's called tribalbook.org. And so that works. And then I have a personal website. It's called michaelwmorris.com. And that can also bring you to the book website. But it also tells you about the decades of research that I've done on these topics, that are published in behavioral science journals, if that kind of thing interests you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time, Michael.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really a privilege.